So, hi everyone, thanks a lot for joining us for this 11th Urban AI conversation. And today we are going to talk about mobility as a service. My name is Hubert and I'm the founder of Urban AI. So what is Urban AI? Urban AI is a think tank that federates a global community of pioneers in the emerging field of urban artificial intelligence. Together, we are investigating this concept and we propose ethical modes of governance and sustainable uses of Urban AI. But Urban AI is also a space for exchange and debate, and this is why we regularly organize these Urban AI conversations, during which members of the community can present you their latest research, contribution, or even ideas. And today, to talk about mobility as a service, we have the great pleasure and honor to have with us actually two of the greatest experts on this topic, Aurélien Cottet, who is the International Sales Director at Instant System, and Scott Shepard, who is the Chief Commercial and Project Officer at Aziz Top. So first question, and it will be for you, Scott. Could you tell us maybe how has mass mobility as a service evolved over the past few years?
Indeed. No, thank you for having me here today, and thank you for the question. So yes, mass mobility as a service. It's gone through many different, I would say, evolutions and many different kind of offers over the last few years. From its inception, roughly circa 2014, 2015 in the Nordics, in Finland, to kind of where we're at today. So there's been many different, I would say, stakeholders that have promoted mass, and many different, I would say, models that have been brought to consumers as well as that have been sold. But just to kind of provide a really high level kind of path to where we are today, at a very kind of simple level, it was started off as a basic, let's say, aggregation of available mobility services in a metropolitan district or a region. And how this was assembled was obviously through a kind of a smartphone availability, a smartphone application that would be offered through download, as offered for free to consumers. So what we would like to call this in a kind of economic perspective is classified as B2C, business to consumer, so that any particular person open to general society could download an app and discover and find the available services within their region. And the supply of these services could range from public transport all the way to private mobility providers. And the first use cases that started being integrated in the ecosystem were arranged much more around private vehicular mobility, such as car share. So we saw many different car share aggregators that started assembling mass-like applications roughly in 2016, 2017, such as my former employer, CarJump, which became rebranded as Free to Move, which is now a subsidiary of PSA Group, or now called Stellantis. So you saw many different actors in the ecosystem kind of arranging and assembling the available supply of mobility providers to general consumers. Now, as this started maturing over the course of the next few years, investors, as well as other, I would say, catalysts that were looking to participate in mass, were starting to either promote or ask more detailed questions in terms of what is a long-term business sustainability of this offer. And what I mean by that is, how is mass going to turn a profit? This is all great that we have an assemblage or an aggregation of available mobility supply, but from an economic standpoint, and I will pivot to allow Aurélien to also speak on this topic too, but is there enough pieces of the commercial pie for all the mobility actors to basically turn a profit? Whether or not, are there enough commissions to share? Is there enough revenue to gain? Are there licenses that can actually be promoted through different mass offers, either direct to consumer or to potential third-party clients. And what we started seeing just about before the time of COVID hit, let's say around 2019, is that in the general ecosystem, there was a transformation in mass, a bit away from the direct-to-consumer model, business to consumer, towards more of an independent actor who would stimulate the mobility supply and actually license these services. So what we started seeing were either private actors, private mobility suppliers, build their own mass platforms for consumers, and then they would aggregate services. Or you saw public actors such as public transport authorities, municipalities, et cetera, that would actually assemble the mobility supply and create that ecosystem. And again, this was a move away from that general kind of direct to consumer model so that the mass offer could essentially provide much more connectivity and intermodality that would be promoted for sustainable mobility goals. So the transformation now is we have business to business consumer or business to government to consumer. And I would say as we emerge post-COVID, that trend is only accelerating, meaning public and private actors are serving to stimulate the shared mobility ecosystem, either directly or indirectly, and providing those digital services. But I will pause and let Aurélien kind of share his thoughts too, of course.
So it's a good sum up. What is great is so Scott was on the B2C market before being on the marketing, the international sales director at Instant System. I used to be the mobility as a service expert for Transdev. So Transdev is one of the biggest public transport operator around the world, and it was the first public transport operator that saw that the mass would have an impact on the mobility of the daily life of everyone. So that's why back in 2015, Transdev invested in the very well-known Mass Global, that is the company in Finland that developed the first mass operation in the world after the pilot that was Ubigo developed for Goldberg 2 years before. So Mass Global developed WIM. That was the first mass B2C. As a PTO, so public transport operator, Transdev foreseen that the mobility couldn't be managed directly by an application only for consumer. Why? It's because first, mobility as a service, by definition, the backbone is the public transport. So either if you are a private mass or a public mass, you need the public transport as a backbone to move the mass of people. So that's one thing. We know by definition also that outside Hong Kong and Japan, everywhere in the world, the public transport is subsidized, or at least what we call, say, financially compensated. So the end user is not paying the full price of the reality of the cost of a public transport. So in terms of business model, we realize that the mass would be more an extension of the public transport in most of the cities. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about aggregating mobility service, private and public in the same application, there is a difference between medium cities where you're going to have only one bike scheme, one e-scooter scheme, one car sharing scheme. So one mobility service provider for each kind of mode versus big cities like capital, like Paris, where you have 5 e-scooters system, 5 bikes scheme, 5 car sharing. So it's not exactly those numbers, but many different mobility services for the same mode. So when we talk about mobility as a service, when you talk about public transport authority or public transport operator, first is how you manage the mobility of your citizen. So I like to say that at Transdev, we were doing B2G2C, business to government to citizen, where the idea of a mass would be first to serve the people who are already using all those mobility modes, but also to show the people who are using their car how to reduce their part of their car in their overall mobility of their daily lives. And I'm a perfect example. I'm living in Versailles. I mean, in a city that's close to Versailles, nearby Paris. When I want to go to Paris, I take my car, I park at the first metro station, and then I take the public transport. But most of the people around me who are living in Vaucresson, where I'm living, they are taking their car and they go to Paris. So where you can find alternative. Mobility as a service is going to be a solution to show them different way to move around without using completely their car all the time. The evolution of mass, I do agree, we went from B2C to B2G to B2B. We saw also something very interesting for the past 2 years. The employers start to be put at contribution in terms of the mobility of the employee. So you start to see a lot of also application, what we call mass for corporate, where employers decide to give a certain amount per month to be used by the employee to be more sustainable in their daily mobility. And that, I think, it's going to be a big shift because an employee is also a citizen. And I'm going to see a good trend where the employers and the cities will embrace the mobility of the daily mobility of the employee. And that's going to be a revolution, I think.
But does it mean that the market of mass is going to be more fragmented or more unified because of this trend that you are talking about, Aurélien?
So I think a lot of people were worried about, I'm living in this city. If I want to travel, I will have to download the other application. So right now, that's exactly what is happening. That's mean when you're a citizen of one city, you download the application of the public transport of your city. But if you are visiting another city, unfortunately, you may have a choice to either use Google Map or download the application of this new city. Why is that? It's because everything is very local. And it's true that if you think about it, how many people are really traveling outside their own locality? Not that many. In fact, the people who are moving outside vacation for business represent less than 3 or 4% according to the medium cities. So yes, it's a problem that if you want to travel around, it's going to be scattered. Nevertheless, there are some laws right now that are being worked on at the European level to make sure that everything is open and standardized, to make sure that one day you will just have to download one application, your local one, and you're going to be able to travel and use this application to buy the public transport of the city you are visiting, or to book a taxi of the city you are visiting without the need to download an application, a new one. So this is going to happen, and it's going to be in the law to uniform and to enable the roaming. And that's going to be very important. Exactly like the telecom back in the 90s.
Scott, do you share this analysis?
I do. I think the European-wide mobility roaming is a very interesting trend in the mass kind of market, and the enabling of purchasing a ticket or kind of traveling a lot across one app throughout your entire journey, so that you kind of prevent that localization of having to download multiple apps is an interesting opportunity. It's yet to be realized, but I think that that's definitely on the roadmap, and that will lower the barrier of entry for many different participants that want to offer mass-like services. I think there definitely needs to be consideration of the different, I would say, mobility actors in the ecosystem, the different suppliers, because we do need to be aware that there could be a trend towards at least new, I would say, kind of data walled gardens, or kind of data segmentation in the marketplace, that the supply will not be continuous across the value stream. And that is much more of a business or a policy decision related to the mobility providers, given their tendency to want to have that direct relationship with the consumer. So as these services become more unlocked and more seamless to promote kind of intercity mobility roaming is the opportunity, we'll have to kind of monitor and track how these kind of business and commercially driven trends either consolidate or at least work in the interests of consumers so that they are not left, in a more of a weak position. So it's just something for us to, I would say, consider as these new digital opportunities present themselves.
We've seen a kind of tension between public and private actor in mobility as a service. And so how is it being resolved, if it's being resolved, Scott?
Yeah, well, I think that's part of my previous thought is there is that tendency between the public and private sector. And we saw that play out in many different fashions over the last few years, kind of especially before COVID, but still continuing to present day, certainly with different private mobility providers in the micromobility space. So kick scooter providers, bike share providers, et cetera, and having, I would say, a lack of coordination in either sharing data, either obtaining the necessary permits, or basically obtaining permission for operations that would be part of the overall urban scheme for proper planning and infrastructure of sustainable mobility. And why this is important for mobility as a service is because mobility as a service is simply the digital layer that enables micromobility and other shared mobility offers to be presented to consumers, whether they're directly through a individual micromobility app or through an aggregation of services. So this tension was across many lines. It was across data sharing, it was across commercial offers, and then it was also across just physical operations and distribution. So where we're at today is that I think one interesting use case that Aurélien had mentioned around intercity roaming for passengers is an opportunity for better coordination between public and private actors. It serves as a stimulant to actually attract private mobility operators into kind of shared mass platforms and digital infrastructure layers. So it reduces that barrier to entry so that their fear of losing that relationship with the customer is reduced, one. And the second fear of the private mobility providers is a fear of commodification, meaning they don't want to be one of many. Now, if we are to open up those digital channels so that there are more kind of consumer business models that private mobility actors can participate in, it's not a zero-sum game. They can actually attract new revenue streams, one, and two, it reduces that tension of creating these kind of privatized consumer ecosystems where they control a monopoly and they're much more willing to participate. And this is important because then they're much more servicing and aligned with public policy, which is the key initiative of any government, municipality, or even public transport authority, is to deliver value to its citizens and its taxpayers. So if we can reduce these barriers to entry and make it more attractive for the private mobility operators in a digital ecosystem, such as data sharing, such as intercity mobility roaming, and just kind of moving towards much more of a spirit of public-private cooperation. We're seeing many different kick scooter and micromobility providers here in Europe taking a proactive approach for approaching cities, obtaining permission, and aligning with a city and a region's goals. We won't repeat those mistakes of the scooter battles we saw in 2018, 2019, which started in the United States and then basically got replicated in France. They got replicated in Spain and many different European countries. We want to move away from that much more towards kind of a combined offer, and mobility as a service provides that opportunity to bring both of those two worlds together and reduce that tension. But I'll open that up to Aurélien to see what his thoughts are.
I completely do agree with you, Scott. What is very interesting is for past, I would say, year and a half before, as Instant System is a company that is doing digital solution for public transport authority and public transport operators, white label. That means we don't appear at all. Like for instance, if you go in Paris and you download the IDFM, that is the application of Île-de-France Mobility, the official application, that's us. So to get those e-scooter or e-bike sharing scheme to be integrated in our platform 2 years ago, it was a nightmare. They were like, we don't need you, we don't want you. Now they knock at the door and say how we can work together. The shift is they understood, I think, at least at the European level, that everything's going to be regulated in terms of number of e-scooter, where they will have to operate. They may be forced to operate in some places where the demand is not as huge as the one they are used to when they're in the center of the city. And it's possible that more and more of those private shared mobility services will be also subsidized. So suddenly those companies understood that if they really want at one moment or another in the long-term future to operate in most of the city they want to deploy to their solution, they will have to compose with the public sector. And so before fighting with them to try to get a contract with them just to integrate them, it was a nightmare. Now it's different. I really see a shift, partnerships shift. And as Scott said, they're also in a lot of discussion on how standardize their own business to make sure that it could be implemented and integrated at no cost. Because the problem is integration, mass as a cost, and the integration part has a huge cost. If you think about integrating one actor, even if the API is there, it could miss something. You can still need a lot of test and learn before launching the application live. And that's what I think the big shift is they realize that public transport and shared mobility are two very complementary businesses that one can, they can live without the other, but they can only grow if they integrate the other. And that's a new one. The second part is if you think in the long term, where many cities will have some zone where car won't be allowed, you're gonna need to have alternative. And I see also a huge trend in Europe, but also in North America, of transport on demand. That is the first mile, last mile complementary solution in the suburbs that pick up people to bring them to a mobility hub with a public transport.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Hubert. I think I have some additional thoughts on that. Maybe we can keep this in a conversational format, because I think Aurélien makes a good point, and I do have some thoughts on on-demand transits. It's been a burning issue for me, and it's something that we're working on at my new company, Assist2B, because our key goal is leveraging artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning to better optimize and plan and strengthen the role of public transport here in Europe, but also North America too. But I think the real caveat here, and I think Aurélien and I share the same goal and philosophy though, is to strengthen the role first and foremost of fixed route public transport. That comes first before anything. And then on-demand transit, or as we Americans call on the other side of the Atlantic, microtransit, is a complementary to that. That is an add-on, and that serves another American term we use are transit deserts, these gaps in coverage where there is not sustainable and strong and frequent public transport fixed route. However, there is a problem though with microtransit. There's a problem with on-demand transit and how that fits into mass. And I'm going to present that to the audience here today. And that's something that's part of our goal at Assist2B and what we're doing is DRT, as we call it in Europe, or microtransit in the United States, again, is a complement to provide much more of a healthy and strong multimodal ecosystem with public transport as the core, and then fixed route at the core. Unfortunately, there are policy decisions that need to be made by public transport authorities that are purely a matter of physical geometry. For the engineers in the audience, you'll understand this. There is a choice that needs to be made between basically ridership and coverage. And unfortunately, in the world of DRT and microtransit, many times these two policy choices are being presented as being able to be resolved at the same time. Yet that is impossible. You have to make a policy choice. You can either provide a higher level of ridership in a fixed route corridor, or you can perform more coverage based upon much more of an on-demand service. But it's really impossible to offer both at the same time. And that's one of the challenges, though, in this offer, is that really it needs to be thought of as a feeder service or a complement to fill in these gaps in the multimodal ecosystem. But the key takeaway that I just like to present to the audience, and I like to hear even Aurélien's thoughts too, is it cannot cannibalize fixed route. And that's what we're seeing in North America right now. And it's a very troublesome trend. We're seeing a cannibalization of fixed route, and we're seeing a privatization of fixed route by private on-demand services. And I'm trying to be as controversial as possible here, because this is a conversation I want everyone to think about this, because if we have a healthy mass ecosystem that's public and private, there needs to be a balance of public and private. There needs to be a balance of fixed route and on-demand, and it has to serve mutually agreed upon policy goals. One cannot cannibalize the other, but in the United States right now, we're seeing that. We're seeing it especially right now in the Sun Belt region. So in Texas, in Florida, in North Carolina, and other regions, Arizona, I don't like it. I'm very troubled by it because it's weakening the role of the public sector, and it's siphoning taxpayer dollars to on-demand services to private operators that should be used to strengthen fixed route, complemented with the US Infrastructure Act, the $1.1 trillion act, to actually boost frequency and coverage and actually provide a better service, because we're seeing a huge shortage of bus drivers in the United States right now. And they're actually having to cut and reduce service, like in Seattle, in Denver, in Boston, in many cities. We can't have that. So I'm very concerned by that. And I'm not sure if DRT or on-demand is the silver bullet we're looking for. It needs to be a complement, not a replacement. So I went on a tangent there because I wanted to share that.
Yeah, I think I may
respond to that.
Okay.
This is Albert speaking.
Okay, go ahead.
Because I worked on that model for Miami-Dade in 2018. But it's a continuous dilemma, because if you don't get people on the bus, you have to cut services. But if you cut services, you get less people on the bus. So implementing that feeder network, so a star network with smaller buses from regions, because this is, I wouldn't say typically American, but it's really defining the American cities. Because I lived in Dallas, getting on a train, I had to take the car to get to the train station because there was no bus service. So this is
So your transit desert.
Have that definition of an entire network. Otherwise, it's a commercial market.
Yeah, but I think there is a difference between DRT that is managed by the PTO. Like in Europe, for instance, you reduce the length of your bus line, and at the both extremity, you do have a DRT to make sure that you don't have only one person at the beginning of the line, but you can have like 10 or 15. The difference is when you have DRT that are private, their only goal, and it's normal if they are private, is to make money. So they're only gonna serve the people who can afford the service, and they're gonna be very good for that. But DRT has to be also for everyone So it has to be very inclusive for anyone who needs public transport. And that's very important. And to be honest, before working for Transdev, I had no notion about that. So transportation, I use a public transport, but I didn't know how it worked, how difficult it is, and how much it costs too. So it was an interesting revelation when you know that you only pay 40% of your ticket when you go in the subway in Paris. Mm-hmm. But to come back to DRT, I saw many tenders from cities to tackle the fact that they try to bring people in buses. And the only way is, as you mentioned, try to make sure that people are using the DRT to go back to the train station. But you can't have 80 place buses running for only 10 people. Yeah, I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago, Uber and Lyft had some contract with some cities to do DRT in certain neighborhood. Some were successful, some were not. It could be interesting to know why. And at that time, Uber and Lyft were subsidized, or at least I would say financially compensated. So for me, and after that, you could have also a different problem. In Amsterdam, for instance, during rush hour, you prefer people taking their own car because it's people, I mean, the public transport is completely full. It's overflowing by people who want to take the public transport. That's why you have a ticket for the different price during rush hour or off-peak hours, to push people to take the public transport when they can outside the peak hours. There, DRT could be also a solution. That's why also in some part in Europe, carpooling is pushed with financial or tax deduction rewarding, because we need to make sure that every transportation asset is used at its maximum, especially for the public transport.
Scott, do you want to react or?
No, I'm in complete agreement. I think it has to be needs-based and essentially aligned with one, public policy and demand. Two, it needs to maximize our investment in public infrastructure, and needs to service the citizens. So I think if we take it from that perspective, then we start coming up with much more meaningful solutions that are context-based versus either kind of, I would say, either overly privatized or, we are doing kind of an extreme modal shift where that might not necessarily be solving the problems that we're addressing. So I just think, as a key takeaway is we don't want to be creating unnecessary problems than what we're trying to identify here. And I think that's just another example of where we might be overthinking or overcomplicating this, and certainly in terms of how these different services interplay and should be complementary and not mutually exclusive. That's really the key takeaway.
I think we saw during this conversation, like some like how MaaS can help us to have a more sustainable mobility. And I was wondering, like, how could we use MaaS like to have even like low carbon cities? Because we know that when we are talking about climate crisis, greenhouse emission, transport are a huge part of it. So how can mobility as a service be part of the solution to create low carbon cities?
I think the interesting part of MaaS is aggregating all the mobility, all the silos in one roof. What I mean by this is, like, you have a taxi on one side, the ride-hailing on the other side, the e-scooter on the other side, the car sharing, etc. And now with the MaaS, suddenly you have everything under one roof. when you know where, the interesting part also of that is, if you know where is the demand on what the offer is at disposal, you can react nearly in real time to know where you could, where are your red zone, that means too much offer for lower demand, versus the opposite, that could be also red zone with too much demand without any offers, or no offer at all. And what is going to be interesting about mass is the more people are going to use this system that's going to show alternative or reduction of the journey of a car in the journey, we're going to start educating people. I also think, unfortunately, that like everyone is human, so you need to go for something. We go to work because we like the work we're working on, and we earn money. And with this money, you can buy things and go to vacation, etc., etc. I think the shift to reduce CO2 will come from because people will be incitated to use alternative modes. And for me, there are two ways for that. The city and the territory, the government will play a huge role on that, either directly or indirectly. It depends on the government. And for that, if you look at the mobility in general, outside the mobility of goods, most of the mobility is done by people who go to work. So the employer will be also a key player in the reduction of CO2. If you think that in Belgium or in Netherlands, now companies with more than 250 employees do have to fill a report of carbon footprint of the employee during their commute. That's just a report. But at one moment or another, this carbon footprint will be part of a carbon footprint of the overhaul of the company. And there you will see employers going to push their employee to be more sustainable, to reduce this carbon footprint, to pay less taxes. So it's an overhaul. There is no one solution. It's a lot of actors that needs to play a key role in the reduction, to make sure that the reduction of carbon in cities will be there next year, in 2 years, in 3 years, and hopefully we will produce less carbon than we save.
I would probably just add and complement that thought, which I'm in full agreement, is it has to be based upon subsidies and basically social policy and economic stimulus from public and private stakeholders. Not to say that individual consumers will not do this on their own, but if we look at kind of, the first versions of mass, the business to consumer model starting in circa 2014 to 2016, or I like to use the French term laissez-faire mass, just let the free market run its course. It didn't work. It was a failure. So there has to be much more of a Keynesian kind of a demand side economic stimulus, an economic stimulus to promote better public policy towards a sustainable green low carbon mobility from public actors and private actors. Private actors meaning corporate employers, public actors, public authorities, through a combination of, to use the American term, carrots and sticks. So incentives and penalties, but bundle much more on the carrot side, the incentive side, to make it as appealing and sticky as possible through digital channels such as mass, to make this experience for consumers as seamless and as painless and as attractive as possible, but always with a key motivation. There's a driver behind the scenes, which is public policy, lower carbon footprint. And how are you going to get from point A to point B to implement that public policy? Through a combination of these measures and levers. But it cannot be done just independently on its own. The common American notion, build it and they will come. They're not going to come. So we need to kind of force the hand a bit. We need to kind of look a little bit more at nudging and behavioral psychology to better stimulate more desirable outcomes. And that can be done through many different measures, but mass is basically an independent digital channel, and you can achieve any outcome you want with mass, either low carbon or high carbon if you want. Obviously, none of us want that, but if we want to promote low carbon, then we can use these public policy levers that are implemented by the key actors in the ecosystem to achieve these goals. And mass is basically just a tool in the toolbox that can achieve these types of outcomes, along with much more the traditional urban planning measures in building much more sustainable physical infrastructure, such as multimodal hubs, bike lanes, walking paths, car-free city centers, and other, I would say, measures that align with sustainable urban mobility plans, SUMPs, that we have here in Europe. So mass is really the digital layer of the SUMP, and it interplays with the sustainable urban mobility. That is really the package that we want to implement throughout our European cities and regions. And I just see it as the digital infrastructure layer for physical infrastructure that we're trying to promote and expand in European cities post-COVID.
I think also the new generation are more aware of carbon footprint.
Yeah, maybe I was a little too cynical. Yeah, because there are individual actors and consumers that will.
And I have to admit, personal experience. This weekend, I was at my parents', and I was going to the swimming pool with the neighbors of my parents, who are 10 years younger than my parents. So their children are 10 years younger than me, and they all, take the train when they have to go from Paris to Lyon. They can take the train, but if they want to go to Paris to Nice, it's 5 hours train. It doesn't matter. They take the train, the night train. It's a reflex that they're taking. So I think with a new generation, it's going to be easier because they're more aware and very concerned about the CO2 emission they are producing with their mobility. It doesn't mean that they're going to stop traveling. They're going to travel differently than us.
As we are in a urban AI conversation, let's talk a bit about artificial intelligence. How could technologies such as machine learning enrich mobility as a service? So, and I'm gonna let Scott after that talk about it because he is more aware about that than me. But the more data, as soon as everything is connected on with the right data, because being connected is good, but you need to provide the right data, you're unable to really understand the mobility as an organism. And if you know the mobility as an organism that is controlled and managed and with all those data, you can nearly react in real time. I give you an example. You have an accident on the main road where the buses will be blocked. Everyone who has the application and are used to use this line could get a notification saying, we got an accident, you're going to have a delay on your usual traveling path. That's the alternatives. These kind of things can only be done with AI. The more we're gonna learn from the data on how people are moving and etc., the more we're gonna be in capacity to give them an answer when we will have unpredicted events. It could be also how to optimize the mobility with predicted events. We are going to have a huge work roads in the major streets in the city that's going to have an impact for people in the public transport, but also for the bike, for instance, because the road is cut, and also for the people who are using their car. How you reorganize the information so people can contour this kind of problem that can last for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. How do you manage the mobility when you have a huge event in your city? You are hosting the Olympic game for a week. What's going to happen?
you are hosting a soccer game that is going to bring a lot of people from 2 p.m. up to 2 a.m. or 5 a.m. in the morning. And it's going to have an impact in the city. With everything connected, with the knowledge, AI should be able to send the right message to everyone, personalized according to the mobility they are used to. I don't know if if it's clear what I'm just said.
No, I think you said it perfectly. The only thing I would add to that is the company that I represent, Assisted, we're laser focused on AI and machine learning for the optimization, again, of public transport, but how that fits into the ecosystem of mobility as a service is quite important, obviously, because that's one of the key modes to consider. And when you factor in special events, emergencies as other kind of deviations to the typical mobility routine, understanding data-driven historical patterns and being able to process that through algorithms and come up with better assumptions or predictions, whether or not you look at the base case of your historical analysis and run a prediction model of what a particular outlier could be in the future, is of critical importance to private mobility actors as well as public authorities to better understand the actual, I would say, mobility transport network. But also it's important for, I would say, planners and other participants to be able to manually intervene and then enter their own assumptions, attributes, and parameters using data that is processed through AI and machine learning to come up with their own kind of best case scenarios of optimization or long range planning and adjustments to their public transport network. So what we like to think of this, and just to kind of give everyone a real brief overview, is there's 3 stages to the process of AI and machine learning for optimization of public transport, and then how that relates to mobility as a service, because mobility as a service is part of this as well too, is you want to explore your network. The first step, you want to look at what it is now and historically. You want to optimize, you want to make short-term interventions that are AI and machine learning enabled, whether through automated predictions or through manual interventions, and then come up with better, I would say, outcomes that are either environmentally, economically, or socially driven. And then finally, utilizing these technologies that can embrace multimodality and mobility as a service, plan your future transport network that is aligned with sustainable urban mobility. So your public transport network and mobility as a service has to be aligned with public policy and the sustainable urban mobility plans, SUMPs. So this is where we have the synthesis of land use, urban planning, public transport, and digital layers such as MAS that actually demonstrate better outcomes for sustainable mobility. And these are the opportunities of AI and machine learning to basically leverage the best of real transport demand and real transport need historically to make better assumptions and analyses on a future looking scenario. So also, I think this is really important because this democratizes the process too. This puts data and power in the hands of individual citizens, as well as public authorities that are looking to gain a better insight and understanding into the health and diagnostics of their transport network. Now, this does not seek to replace private transport consultancies or contractors or vendors, but it really levels the playing field so that everyone has much better insights that are data-driven, utilizing the best of AI and machine learning that can produce better outcomes for the urban planning process, but also that can be layered into more meaningful mass use cases, as well as consumer offers that are a bit of a deviation from, like I said before, mass 1.0, the simplistic aggregation, towards much better outcomes that are policy driven. So AI machine learning for better mass and better urban planning.
Thanks.
I do agree. I'm just going to add something. It's there is a big city in the US that wish that they had AI like this for a long time.
Is it the one I'm from? I'm from LA. No, it's not Los Angeles, is it?
in fact, the bus line was designed for blue collars to to go in the center of the city to make sure that they can perform their job. It turned out that those poor neighborhoods where people were living were bought out by investors, and suddenly those blue collars people had to move from where they lived to another part of the city, where no bus line were there to drive them to the center of the city. So they started to buy some second, third, fourth hand car. And because of those not well-maintained cars, suddenly more and more accidents or traffic jam occur in this city. And they realized a few years later that, in fact, the people who were causing those accidents were people who couldn't go to work because they didn't have any alternative like the bus that they used to have before. If everything had been connected on AI with a good AI, they would have anticipated this problem. And maybe less accident would have occurred, less traffic jam would have occurred, and even for the people who were in the need of public transport would have not spent a lot of their little money on a second, third, or fourth hand car.
That's super interesting to see like how AI can be used and machine learning, of course, as an additional layer in mass and help to optimize the city to create safer mobility, as you said it, Aurélien. I think we are going to start quickly the Q&A session.
Yeah.
Actually, we had several very interesting questions in the chat. We had one from Antoine, but I think you already in a way answered this question, because Antoine asked, should mass application favor certain types of transports, or should it be the cities to decide? But in a way, you already answered this question, Aurélien and Scott. Albert, we have a question, I guess. Do you want to open your micro, Albert, and directly ask your question?
Well, it's not so much a question.
It's a statement.
It's the discussion between the technology push and what cities can do in this. In the end, it's you, me, us. We are the users, and our profiles and personal conditions tell us what type of mobility services we can use. An inclusive model of mobility services in the city. For some people, it could be the kick scooter. For some people, it could be a shared bike. Others cannot. They have to rely on buses that are equipped to get a wheelchair in, and they have to use an elevator to get to a platform to get into a train. I mean, we all know London, mind the gap. Means if you're in a wheelchair, it says you don't leave the train. So there's so much more in this whole mobility scheme than the commercial side of it. I mean, the city should take responsibility to have a permit for a mobility provider. In that permit, there's an agreement, shared data of position and availability of the service. Basically, the city helps you to sell your service. And yes, you're in competition between Scott, you referred to that in 2018 when the scooters were pushed to the streets. I was in Dallas. We were surprised. In the morning, we had the green ones. In the afternoon, we had green ones and orange ones. And then the next day, we had yellow ones and silver ones. And a week later, we all found them in the river, because Americans don't drive a bike and they use it for 5 minutes, 10 minutes because it's fun, and then they get rid of it.
Those were the scooter wars in 2018.
But as a city takes responsibility, they can see who, or maybe we, using the bikes are in control of where the position of the bikes is, and make sure they have a clean setup of the bikes, and take responsibility for that, because they know who's the user, and they know what user left the bike somewhere in a not so smart position. Let's call it that simple. So you have to leave that to the commercial side. From a city, if you want to create an inclusive multimodal traffic model to reduce local emissions and improve services, you need to take that position.
Of course.
And as you said, Scott, MAS is that intelligent data sharing model behind this all, and there could be hundreds of apps accessing the data. That's not the front end.
Mm-hmm.
It's selling through the data, and then if you choose a modality, you pay to the provider, and maybe that payment scheme is something you can organize and unify. That's country by country basis, because not in Europe you can do it basically everywhere. If you rely on the credit card services, it's fine. You can do it global, but it's different. Not every user will have a credit card.
You know, it's interesting what you are saying about that, because at Instant Systems, so we have more than 86 applications for 86 cities, and one is Brussels, where we did the mobility as a service pilot for nearly 3 years. And we have also this mode saying, okay, if you are in reduced mobility person, you can tick it, and we show exactly everything that is available at your disposal from A to B, because there is no sense for a person in a wheelchair to see where are the bikes or e-scooter. That's kind of stupid. It's good to know where you need to go in the train station to make sure that you can go with your wheelchair, because in one place it's going to be the steps, and the other one is going to be flat with a slope where you're going to be able to go. This kind of information, and that's why I think it's very important that MAS, at least that each MAS should have one public MAS, because it has to be inclusive for everyone, and especially for this case. I give you a simple example. City Mapper in London is still the most used application, but TfL, that decided to stop their application, decided to redeploy an application because City Mapper was not doing a great job for putting the information for reduced mobility people. And I do understand their point. That's not their core business.
Oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, so I think, Albert, you're right. We forgot something is everyone who is not digitalized needs to be also integrated in this scheme, because they are producing data without any digital device. And when you talk about payments, yes, not everyone do have access to a credit card.
Just one point I wanted to add to that too is there's a couple themes that we're starting to unpack here are access and equity. So these are very North American centric themes right now that are front and foremost in public transport and urban planning circles throughout the United States right now, and really leveraging the investment of the US infrastructure bill to promote better accessibility and equity of mobility and public transport, and the role that mobility as a service plays as a digital enabler, because mobility as a service, on its face is neutral. It can serve any purpose or any outcome. But in this case, if you want to deliver better mobility access or better mobility equity, you have to think about these actual really fundamental and critical considerations related to wheelchair access, access for elderly, disabled, disadvantaged communities, et cetera, and case in point right now, a project in the US right now that is being heavily criticized in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Move PGH project. It was marketed as the United States' first mobility as a service project back in July of 2021, a consortium of primarily private stakeholders. So scooter, bike share, carpool, et cetera, with a partnership with the city of Pittsburgh and with the public transport operator, Port Authority of Allegheny County. But the problem, though, is that geographically, the distribution and the access of the shared use mobility hubs, as well as the availability services in the MAS platform, did not reach those economically disadvantaged communities in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that would have benefited the most from low subsidized economic shared mobility. So basically, there has been some very interesting insights from that project that basically demonstrated there was a lack of community stakeholder engagement, as well as understanding what the needs of the local citizens would have gained from a multimodal mobility as a service platform such as this. So I think that we need to kind of take a step back and look at investments, whether they're public and private, that actually are outcomes-based, that I address and identify communities that will benefit the most from accessibility as well as equity and other public policy levers such as environmental sustainability, low carbon footprint, et cetera. Again, MAS is public policy neutral. It can serve any one of these. And then we work back and right size it, because otherwise we're going to have hundreds of more pilots that are demonstrated that basically are terminal, and they're heavily criticized, and they do not really solve these critical urban issues that we're trying to deal with post-COVID and with climate change. And I use the Move PGH project as one example of a missed opportunity. It could have been done much differently. It could have served much more disadvantaged communities that would have provided better mobility access.
Thanks for your answer, Aurélien and Scott. Maybe very quickly, like in 1 minute, Georgie, I will try to reformulate your question to make it easier to answer. Scott, Aurélien, would you say that COVID-19 crisis has been an accelerator for adopting MAS or not?
I think at least the COVID for me helped to accelerate the digitalization of public transport. What I mean by this is it helped public transport authority or operator to acquire or deploy an e-ticketing system. So a system where the user, the traveler, doesn't have any interaction with someone else. So not because they didn't want to talk with the bus driver or the cashier but because of the pandemic, because they were fearing that the person in front of them, and vice versa, the cashier or the bus driver, they didn't want to handle anymore the cash and the interaction with the travelers. So the pandemic helped that. And it's very important because if we think that the public transport is the backbone of the MAS, without digitalizing the access, the consumption of this mobility digitally, you can't have MAS. So yes, it's speed up, at least at the technical level. Nevertheless, MAS is still a cooperation, a partnership between public and private. So it's before being a technical issue, it's a commercial issue. So the commercial issue did not really, the pandemic didn't help, but it helped technically speaking.
My perspective, I think MAS has benefited from the COVID pandemic, and certainly public transport and multimodality. At first, we thought public transport would be dead. We thought everyone would be traveling in their cars. Everyone would be moving away from cities. And, cities and public transport would die, at least maybe in North America, but even in Europe. And what we've seen is quite the opposite in terms of recovery of public transport at 95% ridership levels of 2019. So we're almost 100% to where we were 3 years ago, one. And two, MAS has been a beneficiary of that because it's forced municipalities as well as public authorities and PTAs to embrace private modes and private mobility operators and the concept of multimodality. So it's broken down many different silos of, I would say, control and data sharing, so that public transport realizes that they cannot succeed and survive post-pandemic without embracing the connections digitally to private mobility modes, such as bike share, car share, et cetera. And MAS, again, is that digital channel and enabler to a better link and strengthen their role post-COVID. So while at first we saw, a high reluctance to public transport, social distancing, as well as individual, mobility, ridership has recovered, and MAS has served as that enabler to create those connections across modes for a much more sustainable outcome.
Great. I see we still have some questions in the chat. If you still have questions, please, you can, I guess, directly send a message to Scott or Aurélien on link or on
Sure.
LinkedIn. Yeah. Okay. So perfect.
Yeah.
A pleasure.
So Moritz and other, feel free to directly ask Aurélien and Scott. Aurélien, Scott, thanks a lot for this very insightful and fascinating conversation about mobility as a service, and actually also mobility and the future of cities. It was really great to have you. Thanks to everyone for attending this session and for your questions. This is already the end of this Urban AI conversation. The recording will be very soon available on our YouTube channel, and our next Urban AI conversation will be next week, and it will be about real estate in the age of data. So this time we are going to talk about buildings. So thanks again for attending this session. Have a great day and see you next week. Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you very much.